Recording in progress. Okay. So, my friends, I am so very excited to welcome you all to this. I mean, gosh, this has got to be the eighth Podstack now. The eighth, and as I was just saying, increasingly professional Podstack.
I
Uh,
love the word Podstack. Sorry, side
I,
note.
yeah, Podstack. That was not mine. That was the first guest. He coined that. But yes, the increasingly, though still marginally professional process of me talking to my friends about their amazing books for an hour to 90 minutes. So this week we have the incomparable Antonia Angress, whose book, Sirens and Muses, is amazing. It's a very, very well-deserved National Book Foundation 535 winner. Just like nominated and won for a variety of things. It's her debut, and it is a tour de force. This is a book that um, if you all are fans of The Interestings, okay, I know, well, at least I hope many of you have heard of it or read it. This is a book that kind of treads similar territory where we're talking about, those bonds, those connections forged in the hothouse art school environment and how those connections strengthen or deteriorate or, whatever, as these young artists go forth in the world. So, the story is, that the story you've written, Antonia, is both, to my mind, a Bildungsroman and a Künstlerroman, and happily a queer love story, a very tender and just excellent queer love story. We get to know four different artists, three young students at RIN, this really kind of selective art academy in America's Northeast.
Mhm.
And they're kind of a quasi, down on his luck-ish professor, Robert Berger. And it's amazing because the story starts as a campus novel and it becomes something else entirely, right? We sort of shift locations from the very small world of the RIN campus to the larger world of the New York art scene. So, in, talking about this, I mean, we're going to have a lot to talk about. So, before I kind of launch us into where I imagine we're going to get to in the next like hour, I want you, Antonia, please kick us off with a selection from this book. There's just so much to be loved about your writing, about your prose stylings that I just am excited for the viewers slash listeners to hear.
All right, so I'm gonna read a scene from the first half of the book. And I realize that's annoying if you haven't read the book to like jump into the middle,
It's
and not read from the beginning. But if you have not read the book, there's not that much you need to know.
yeah.
We have these two roommates, Louisa and Karina. They've had kind of a tense relationship, and Luisa has asked her roommate Karina to pose nude for her for a series of paintings, and Karina, to her surprise, has agreed. So this is the first time that Karina poses for Luisa. Luisa switched on the floor lamp and adjusted the light's angle. Karina had never heard her speak so assertively, and she didn't avert her eyes from Karina's body the way she did when Karina undressed in their dorm room. The opposite, she looked at her straight on with bold, electrifying frankness. She perched herself on the stool and pulled the easel toward her. She lifted her eyes and took Karina in. Then, without preamble, she began to draw. The brisk flick, flick, flick of Louisa's gaze made the hair rise on Karina's arms, though she wasn't cold anymore. The space heater purred at her side. With her eyes closed, she could almost pretend it was sunlight on her skin. At first, her body rebelled, twitching and trembling, and she had to force her muscles into submission, but eventually she settled into stillness. After about an hour, Louisa's voice broke through the silence, asking if Karina needed a break. Yeah, thanks. Her voice was hoarse. She stood stiffly, tugging her dress over her head, and padded to the bathroom. The three stall doors were covered in graffiti. Above the paper towel dispenser, someone had written, "Art is the only salvation from the horror of existence." Underneath, scratched out in ballpoint, "Speak for yourself." Karina peed, turned on the faucet, waited for the water to warm up. She examined herself in the mirror. Her cheeks were flushed, her pupils dilated, the irises dark and liquid. Her hands shook as she washed them. When she returned, Louisa was mixing a batch of paints on a metal tray, filling the studio with their heady chemical scent. Karina slipped out of her dress and settled back onto the pillow. Was this how I was sitting before? Lean forward a little more. Louisa hopped off her stool and guided Karina's body into place. Karina's skin burned where she'd touched her. Louisa snapped on a pair of latex gloves and began to paint. She worked vigorously, applying the oils in bold brushstrokes with an easy, fluid confidence Karina had never seen in her before, a feverish intensity of purpose. Periodically, she took several steps back and looked at the canvas from afar, frowning slightly. And the longer Karina sat in the beam of her gaze, the more she sensed Louisa's inwardness, the hermetic quality of her mind, the elusive way she glided through the world. Karina watched her, the shifting landscape of her face, the pinched skin between her eyebrows, her mouth tightened in concentration, the thin, strong shoulders, the quick hands. And Karina wanted Louisa to touch her the same way she was touching that painting, gentle one moment and rough the next, smearing the paint with her fingers, working herself into the canvas. An hour. They paused again so Karina could stretch and pee and get a drink of water. Another hour. Finally, Louisa set down her brush. She peeled off her gloves and let out a contented little sigh, an unconscious involuntary sound, one she might have made in her sleep. I think I have all I need for tonight, she said. While Louisa shuttled back and forth between her studio and the sink, cleaning up, Karina got dressed. Can I see it? Karina said. No, not yet, not till it's done. As they walked through the mantle of snow back to their dorm, they chatted about the final for drawing class, but Karina couldn't shake the feeling that they were having an entirely different conversation beneath it. Back in their dorm, Karina changed into pajamas and climbed into bed. She lay there with her eyes half closed, not sleeping, listening as Louisa took the pillow and sheet out of her backpack and remade her bed. She wondered how Louisa had painted her. Had she been kind, or had she been honest? Homing in on Karina's little roll of belly fat, the pimple scab on her chin, the appendectomy scar. Louisa puttered around for a while longer before slipping out into the hallway with her shower caddy. She came back 10 minutes later, turned off her lamp, and got into bed. Just as Karina was drifting off, Louisa said, Do you have time to pose for me again tomorrow night? Sure. Karina smiled into the dark.
Mm. Ah,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you, really. That's a gorgeous scene, when Karina first poses for Louisa. Thank you for reading that. Um, so, okay, I'm going to just launch right into it here. In your I think it's in the afterword to this novel, you say, Antonia, that like there's so many themes of personal resonance for you here, both as the child of an artist and as now the partner of an artist, and of course as an artist yourself, right? As a writer, as a novelist. And you were as you were writing this, like you were kind of answering both for yourself and for the characters, I think a really difficult question that a lot of us in like creative careers, as it were, are asking ourselves. Why make art, right? Why make art if we are expected to, assign it an exchange value, which seems like such a debasement of the object or of the feelings, right, that arise from the art object. Or the experience. Like, why make art, if no one's looking, right? If no one cares about it, right? Why make art if not for external validation? Why make art if not for oneself? All these questions swirling around. You then wrote this book and published it and became a debut novelist and thereby a public artist. So I am curious, just to kick us off, little light question here. Did you find an answer?
I mean, I think what I found is that there are as many answers to that question, why make art, as there are artists.
Mm,
But I think for me personally, um, I spent like almost 7 years working on this book, and I think what that taught me is that in order for me to be in it for the long haul, which I think, any novel undertaking is going to be a long haul. In order for me to do that, the fiction that I'm writing has to be exploring questions and ideas that I find both fascinating and confusing. I think like for me, the part of writing, the reason that I make art is the part of the process where I'm posing questions on the page and reaching toward an answer. That's what gives me the most pleasure. And not necessarily finding that answer, but reaching toward it. It's kind of like that Joan Didion quote, like I write to find out what I think.
mhm,
Um, and I think for me, the reason I make art is to explore topics that I find interesting, but also really confusing, questions that I don't necessarily know the answer to or that I have contradictory answers for.
Mm.
Um, and figuring out that process on the page.
I secondhand that, or secondhand that. I second that. I co-sign it so much. I'm thinking like the almost the answer, like if that question can be said to have an answer, right? It's kind of tautological. It's kind of
Mhm.
Beckettian. Why make art to make art?
Mhm.
Right. And like, because we were talking about memoir, I think, before I started recording, and there's so much about writing about one's personal experience, whether it's embedded in fiction or you're actually just like writing your memoir, that is a thinking through. It is a writing to understand. And that is so immensely pleasurable. In fact, there's almost, for me at least, there's no other outlet as effective as writing.
Mhm.
So yeah, and it's so, I guess my like follow-up question to that, and that's kind of braided through a lot of what I want to talk about with you today is how to not lose sight of that, right? Of the art making as a process of understanding when you get a lot of these outside distractions, right? Career-based, peer-based.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really hard. I like publishing a book was a dream come true, but it also kind of knocked me on my ass because it's it's like it's so like being an author and being a writer are so so different, and I don't think I really understood that until
Mhm.
I published a book.
Yeah.
And it took me like a really long time to kind of get back to a place where I was alone with the work and I didn't have all these voices at my shoulder. Um, and where I could find pleasure in it again and not be worrying about, how many copies is this book gonna sell if I publish it? Like,
Yeah.
will it get reviewed? Like
Um,
those questions.
yeah. Right, the kind of like God, it's the golden shackles or the tin finger cuffs or whatever you want to call them, right? Of like writing with these writing to expectations, right? Or writing out of fear. I want to talk with you about how to sort of I don't know, circumvent those things, right? How to find your way back to the work.
Mhm.
But before we have that discussion, I want to do a little bit of a fun little game here with you. It's so rare that I get to do something like this. Um, I mean, I imagine I will never have Hanya Yana Jahara on on here, both because like whatever, I don't know her, she's super famous or whatever, but she also because she was she was very angry when we asked her for a blurb back in 2018. Sorry if
She,
you're watching, Hanya. I
she
doubt you
seems
are,
really
but
intimidating. I fucking love her work. I would be
oh
terrified to talk
no.
to her.
I know, yeah, I'm so terrified to talk to her. I love her work though. But anyway, if she were to be here, right, she's at like one of the others I could do this with. Let's list, the four primary characters in the book and say how we are like and different, right? Or how we respond to each. How are you, Jude, right? How are you how are you any variety of Jude's other lovers? But I think your book, Like a Little Life, right? Provides this really fantastic template of, these robust four protagonists whom you can just like whose inner worlds you can just delve into so effectively. You do as much, right, in the novel, but I mean, as a reader, it's almost impossible. I mean, I think we fetishize relatability really intensely in the writing, reading, reviewing worlds, but the literal like the reflexive empathy, the empathy that I just like cannot help but feel towards Robert, right? Towards Karina. I mean, that's a world in itself. I'm like, my God, what were my Karina days like? Like, how do I feel like Robert right now? Like all kinds of different stuff. So I am going to name each of our four protagonists who are just like, God, they're so lovable. Preston Utley is also so lovable. Let me be clear. I love them all very much. And I would love to kind of, either you could go first or I could, whatever. We could talk about how we vibe with each,
Sure,
as
let's do
artists.
it.
Beautiful. So we have to start with Karina Piontek. She's the to the manor born daughter of New York City art collectors, an artistic wunderkind plagued by emotional volatility and subsequently anointed by the art scene. Um, We have Louisa Arsenault, a Louisiana-born scholarship student at Rennes, brilliant artist in her own right, forced to choose between a cash-strapped life pursuing her dream in New York or painting the gorgeous Cajun landscapes of her hometown away from the art world's nerve center. We have Preston Utley, um, handsome, wealthy, and damaged anti-capitalist bro with a psychopathic father, a benighted Ule to Karina's Abramovich. I kind of see him.
Mhm.
He's just in the shadow of
I
Karina.
like that.
Extremely online and highly perceptive when it comes to like using the attention economy to his advantage and also to his art's advantage, arguably. And then Robert Berger, the one-hit Gen X wonder who time forgot, known for his masterwork, a portrait of his close friend dying of AIDS, and then briefly for his heavy-handed Reagan-era political art, coasting around on visiting and, jobs and fellowships and bad scotch, has to face the music with some surprisingly positive outcomes. And let me be clear too, I love the way that each of these characters was handled, right? Like it was, oh, you showed them such kindness and kindness in such a way, Antonia, that that I think I think I think people would be surprised to see that the world could be kind is often kind in these ways, right? I think people expect like, oh, an art career, it's gonna be awful. You're gonna struggle, it's gonna be horrible. You're burned out, you're never gonna come back. But actually, there's room for more folks than they ever let on. It's not as much of a zero-sum game. Anyway, I will kind of bookend it there. And why don't you kick us off?
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us how you're like each, unlike each.
Okay, so we'll start with Karina.
Hmm.
So I grew up middle class, like maybe lower middle class, I'd say. So I definitely don't relate to her wealth, but
Hmm.
I do relate to growing up in a family where art is a kind of religion.
Hmm.
Um, I grew up in a secular Jewish household, very much not religious, but art and literature definitely sort of took the place of religion in my family. My parents are both very creative. I grew up surrounded by visual art and books. Um, my family took art really seriously. It was this kind of part of our family culture. And I think that absolutely bled into my portrayal of Karina. Okay, then Louisa. So for Louisa, I definitely relate to her imposter syndrome, her sense of not feeling good enough. Like her, I went to a fancy college where there were lots of fabulously wealthy people and children of celebrities, and actual celebrities. And I spent a lot of time in college feeling inferior and just kind of out of the loop, and like I didn't belong. Like there are all these unspoken rules that I didn't understand. So that experience definitely informed my portrayal of Louisa. Preston, I also love him. A lot of readers really hate him. A lot of readers wish that he wasn't in the book. Um,
He has to be
he
though. Yeah.
has to be. Um, I get that he's awful, but I also kind of love him.
Yeah.
I really relate to his frustration with the status quo, his
Hmm.
indignation at how insular and elitist creative industries can be. Uh,
Hmm.
how like everyone went to the same schools and grew up rich and nobody talks about it,
Hmm.
but everyone knows it. Um, so I relate to that, his frustration with that. And then with Robert, certainly I relate to his fear of irrelevance. Um, and I guess this is kind of a spoiler, so I apologize, but about halfway through the book, Robert starts working with a child after spending all of his career working with college students and, grad students. He starts working with a child and ends up getting a lot out of it, to his surprise. And that I relate to as well. I spent the first 5 years after college teaching as an elementary school teacher, working with really young kids. I've also taught college and I've worked with teenagers, so I've kind of, worked with this very wide age spread. Um, and I think that there's something kind of magical about teaching young kids. They're really not fully formed yet. They're still kind of becoming themselves. And to me, there's something really sacred about helping a person that age become who they're going to be.
Ugh, I love that. Yeah, I think that was actually like one of my favorite one like of the kindnesses shown to the characters, that was one of my favorites. The fact that like, Robert Berger has to take, oh, it's this ego insult. He has to like drop all the laurels and go teach a little kid at the artist atelier, and it changes his life.
Mhm.
And it helps him actually, just what we were talking about earlier, right? It helps him get back from this place of comparison and, like high art and all this sort of status and, whatever the significance or lack of significance his art has. He gets back to his creativity. He figures out why he was doing this in the first place. It's beautiful. And it's economics that forced him to do it, but it's like it like turns his whole thing around. So I'll go in the reverse order then. That's actually what I relate to a lot about Robert. Well, obviously, in addition to like thinking, worries of irrelevance, right? I was an insufferable 20 something who was like, I'm going to die in obscurity. And my friends were like, you gotta shut up right now. Like, I need you to stop saying that. I love you so much. This is so infuriating. But yeah, just sort of it's exactly that, right? Like I've had experiences in my own life where it's not just that I was like, oh, I've achieved enlightenment and now I'm going to stop fetishizing external validation in the forms of money or prizes or publications or whatever. It's, I had to. I had to because, life circumstances, right? Whether it was just like those things not working out in some cases or, some more adverse kind of misadventures leading me to be like, my God, like I have been totally deluding myself that this was something to live for. Um, this is not at all anything to live for. In fact, actually like hearing about writers who I admire so deeply, who are so much farther along in their careers than I am, and hearing them talk about like, oh, I got this prize and this prize, but not that one. And I was like, so you got the Pulitzer and the Guggenheim, but not the National Book Award, and you're gonna hang your hat. Like it doesn't matter where you're at, in that sort of the scale of your career or the level of regard you've received. You can just do this ad infinitum.
Mhm.
And when I finally figured that out, right, it was there was that return to creativity. It was really beautiful. So God, I love Robert's arc so deeply. Preston Utley, Preston Utley, the damaged bro. I think like I totally understand why folks who love this book, who are coming to this for the beautiful, just really gorgeous Portrait of a Lady on Fire kind of creative
Mhm.
queer romance, are like, oh my God, why is this bro here? Why is this chauvinist? And I I think I understand people are saying that, right? I would enjoin them to go back and reread a couple of his chapters because they're so sensitively written. They're so deeply intelligently written. It's just like you portray him again with like such kindness and such dimensionality that I think like would normally maybe not be afforded a character like that in a comparative narrative and a comparable narrative. And so what I love about Preston is like he for me symbolizes like the veneer that I feel like I acquired, in college or in grad school, where I was like, okay, well, I've got to act a certain way, and this is the thing I do, and this is what I say, and this is who I sleep with, and this is my deal.
Mhm.
You acquire your, 20 something persona, and my God, are there cracks in that foundation? Are there ever chinks in that armor? And so I think, the fact that we see Preston's relationship with his dad and how fraught it is, and his, the tragedy with his mother, his dynamic with his with his best friend, which is also insane in its own way, right? It he kind of for me represents like the like molten emotional vulnerable core, the underneath that kind of hard veneer, and
Mhm.
ugh, it's just great. Louisa, God, she's amazing. She's incredible. Louisa to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's so many, I feel like Louisa is like the heart, in many ways, the heart of the book.
Yeah, she is. She's the
Yeah.
first character that I wrote. And she starts the book and she ends the book. And she I think too she's kind of a reader stand-in, right? In the sense that
Mm.
she's the outsider character. But I'm sorry, you go ahead
No, no, no.
and
I will actually, I was going to ask, is she the first character who occurred to you? Like, did you
Mhm.
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, that it shows, and it's just like in the best possible way that she is deeply felt and personal, but also it's so easy for me as the reader, right, to just step into her experience. Yeah, I love Louisa. I love Louisa. I relate to the imposter syndrome. I think I also relate to like the difficult choices, right? So I grew up middle class too. I grew up like middle to upper middle class. So I had like privilege enough to go to, again, yeah, expensive college. But I was not, the child of New York City art collectors, right? I was not like, oh, dad's taking me to Martha's Vineyard to screen his film. It was none of that was happening. Um, I didn't have quite the experience at college you did in terms of the like celebrities on campus, but I think that kind of started to occur in grad school, where I overreacted by like, well, here's my persona. I'm 22 and I know what's going on. Um, I love the way like what I relate to about Louisa is the way is kind of like her she's so like her determination, right? Like she's just like so determined to get as far away as she can from what she perceives to be holding her back, right? Like her mother, she thinks, oh, my mom's really kind of trapped by some stuff, right? My family's trapped. My grandfather's, his health is declining. And she even though she like loves her family dearly and feels constantly pulled back to Louisiana, she has to go forward. And I think what I relate to as well is how she reconciles it, how she sees that the answer, it's not one size, an art, like a creative career is not one size fits all. It's not you move to New York and then you are anointed. Like it looks variable. And this is the kind of the anti-zero sum game campaign I was always making to my MFA students. Everyone can succeed. Kurt Vonnegut was wrong. Um, I know, blasphemy, right? Everyone can succeed here. Everyone in this room can do it. And yeah, Louisa is kind of a fantastic example of like having the talent and determination and realizing that life can look different. So that was beautiful.
Yeah, you don't have to live in New York, babe.
No,
You don't have to do it.
don't have to do it. Don't do it unless you like are like, my God, I want it. It would bring me joy. Which is not a qualia I can imagine embodying, but there are many people who feel that way. And Karina, oh God, Karina is an amazing character. So in what order, I guess it's kind of weird to talk about the order you conceived these these characters, but like how did Karina kind of like emerge for you?
Um, so Karina at first was not a POV character. She was just kind of a secondary character. And then once I decided that this book was going to be sort of a web of life book in the sense that it wasn't going to have just one point of view. It's going to be multiple points of view, and that they were all going to kind of like bounce off of each other. Um, Karina kind of became more of a main character and became a bigger part of the plot. I at the time was not aware of that like and they were roommates meme. Do you know that?
Oh,
Do you know what I'm talking
I
about?
I don't. I'm laughing because it's like, my God, there's a meme for everything. No, what was
There's a meme that it's literally and they were roommates. Um
applies so much to you? Oh man, yeah. That's so
um,
funny.
Yeah, but she was originally just gonna be kind of like a foil. And then over the course of, the 6, 7 years that it took me to write this book, she eventually kind of worked her way into a more prominent position in the novel.
Well, thank God she did because she's incredible. Yeah, I mean, Karina, she starts off right. We see her through Louisa's gaze, just like you said, and it's like, is she going to be the enigmatic Jay Gatz to the mousy Nick Carraway. And uh Karina, in fact, like kind of like Preston, right? Like she like you look at him, you see, bro, there's so much more going on. You know, beneath that veneer. Same with Karina, right? Like everyone has an assumption about her. Everyone thinks XYZ, right? Everyone thinks, oh, she's the rich girl, she's anointed, she's this, she's that. Oh, she's crazy. She's this. She's kind of constantly battling these rumors about herself at the age of 20. It's nuts. And so, yeah, I related to her, not obviously not in terms of the wealth, or nor in terms of the like I have had both this like artistic gift instilled in me from birth and the knowledge of how to market that gift perfectly and how the like the economics of that world works. And they are not in conflict ever. Not that they aren't for her, but um there's an unself-conscious kind of she is able to compartmentalize, let's put it that way. In a way that I don't know that I would have been in her position. But what I really relate to about her is like I just like I relate to like being a young woman and having a lot of ego dystonic stuff happen and caring deeply what people thought of me and having like a hard time emotionally, and like being depressed or like having, moody times as like young folks do. And and just like especially if you're a girl in her late teens and early 20s, everyone's going to make a whole lot of assumptions about you. And then you choose to have a sexual relationship with someone, or you choose to have a friendship with someone. It's almost you're kind of the collectives. That story is the collective's property now, right? It's not your own. And so the idea, right, like of Karina as someone who is she's in the spotlight before she's in the spotlight. She's in, she steps into the New York art world and then she like becomes the big, anointed by art forum and all the fancy people person. But I think the thing I relate to is less that and more like feeling looked at as a kid,
Mhm.
you know? And then kind of like my issue was I was like, oh, I feel looked at in this bad way, in this hard way. These like doctors and adults and other people who don't like me are looking at me poorly. You know what'll solve this? If I become a big famous artist, then they'll look at me kindly. And thank God I figured that out. And did we figured out that like chasing that level of visibility is does not solve anything. And so then I became a writer, which which is a low level of disability or visibility rather. Um, so that's all good. Um, but yeah, these characters are amazing. Thank you for playing that little game with me.
That was so fun.
It's so fun, right? I want a shirt that says like Karina and Louisa and Robert and Preston. You remember those shirts they did for a
I
little?
do. Yeah, yeah. I'm actually thinking of the one that they made for A Little Life.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It was so good. Um, okay, so this is, this is a like a book that it is about millennials. I appreciate that the word millennial was only mentioned a couple times, maybe even just one. But it is about kids in college during the Occupy movement. And it's like the way it strikes home, though, I think, like for me as a member of this generation is it's more than just like here are these cultural touchstones, CDs, floppy disks, run with it. It's actually raising some profound questions for like I guess members of the millennial creative class. How like we saw it was brought to our attention with Occupy. The to the kind of the world's attention, the not only the fact that like wealth inequality is like just it has an absolute stranglehold on our collective economics, but how art, in the case of your book, especially art and capital are incommensurable. Like there's not a way to like assign there's not a way that feels comfortable to assign an exchange value to a book, right? Like I'll try to use books. Like how do I say, oh, Henry James, you get 25 grand, but you person, Jen Hemp correlates, you get $600,000. It's just like such a confusing kind of process. And so
Made up numbers.
sorry.
Made up numbers.
Made up numbers for a extremely abstract concept, capital. Um, so I'm like, I love that you like chose this time and place for your book. And there's also that line where you talk, you state it pretty plainly. You're like, everyone is working on, like selling themselves with their art, right? Because we know to sell your art is to sell yourself. And this is of course where we get the unholy term personal brand. Um, so I'm like really, really would be so curious to hear kind of like what was going through your mind when you chose to set your book during the Occupy period. And any other thoughts that are kind of arising, both now and as you were writing this about art and exchange value and this crazy world we live in.
Yeah, like this idea of like selling yourself. I feel like this idea of selling yourself alongside your work kind of took hold of the art world before it became kind of this like more mainstream idea. I feel like every Gen Zer just kind of naturally
Yeah.
knows what their personal brand is because they've grown up with the internet. And I think our generation is unique in that we had sort of these analog childhoods and the idea of having to make yourself into a personal brand if if you're a person in a creative industry or really if just you're a person on the internet was kind of coming into entering the zeitgeist right around the time that you and I were graduating from college, like right around like, um the rise of Instagram. Um
The rise of Instagram is a fun way to say 2012 for me.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
Again,
that was, I'm just thinking like personal branding wasn't really a thing with Facebook and is
no,
really a thing with Facebook. Like nobody our age, no Gen Zs are on Facebook either.
I,
Um, but that really sort of became um a thing at least in the general populace because of Instagram's kind of visual focus, right? Um, and now we live in an era where every writer and artist is working frantically to create a personal brand. Especially in the publishing world, where so much of the labor of marketing a book is now being offloaded to authors.
yeah.
Um, I will be honest and say that in my ideal world, I would be like Thomas Pynchon. I would be a hermit and nobody would know what I look like. And I'd go into my little cave and write books and never log onto Instagram again. That is not an option for me if I want to keep doing this as a career. Um, so like one of the things that I've, really had to work on, in the first half of my 30s as I've, become a public artist, but also, become a parent and, had like, things in my personal life happening alongside things in my private life is, I mean, sorry, things in my personal life happening alongside things in my professional life is that I've really had to separate sort of the marketing and branding myself as an author from the writing.
Mhm.
Um, it's kind of what we were talking about earlier, how like being an author and being a writer are very, very different and required very different skill set and ask very different things of, kind of your attention and your, kind of outward presentation. Um, I had generally find that like social media makes me feel terrible. Um, I use an internet blocker called Freedom, and I like only allow myself access to Instagram, which is my only social media platform, for a couple of hours a day. Um, But like, of course, I market myself. Like most authors, I try to take cute selfies and I post pictures of my cats. Um, but I'm not very good at that. It makes me really anxious. I really wish my book could just stand on its own, and hopefully that my future books can just stand on their own. Um, and I think now, especially now that I have a kid, I really value my privacy. I'm really cautious about what I post, what I share about my daughter publicly. Um, And, of course, I share myself to an extent. I've written personal essays about like intimate topics like my sexuality. But, in general, I'm not super comfortable with being a public person. I would be a terrible celebrity. Um, so
Antonia, I wouldn't wish celebrity on my worst enemy.
it's a good thing we're writers. Nobody cares about writers.
I'm like, see, this is why I was like, oh, fame, that's bad. Please, nobody care about me. Yeah, no, it's as you were talking, like I was starting to think about starting to think actually about like the sort of the interplay of identity and
Mhm.
self-branding, right? And how, this had not really kind of taken rise at the point of your the point in time at which your novel set, but it has since, right? This concept of um okay, your novel is about X concept or like X experience rather. Well, supply the authenticity. You
Mhm.
know, like oh, Raph, you've written about, say, the Jewish experience. Are you Jewish? Like do you want to know where I was bat mitzvahed? I wasn't bat mitzvahed, so I guess I can't write it. Like
Where was
it's
I?
yeah, I know the secular humanism. Oy. But I like I've seen that sort of demand for like personal authenticity or the kind of the receipts for the narrative. And I've also seen like, I imagine you have as well this pressure, right? If you are a marginalized voice, right? Or if you are in some way I mean, at this point, the umbrella's expanded kind of, it's ever expanding into the horizon. But like, if your voice is deemed marginalized in some way, then it's kind of wild that you wouldn't not only be writing about that, but be writing about that in such a way that it like ties into your branding, and then you have to perform that identity publicly, yada yada. And so, yeah, I'm like really quite curious about this because these characters are more or less untouched by it, right? Like Preston Utley, this is a time in history when Preston Utley isn't like, oh, I'm a piece of shit white man. Like he's not like down on himself for being part of the dominant culture. Um,
But it's
he's a
coming
lot of
for
other
him.
what?
It's coming for him.
Oh, exactly. No, oh God, it's coming for him intensely, specifically. Yeah, absolutely. Like he falls right into the category
Mhm.
of self-loathing young men. But I think, I guess I'm wondering what you think about that. Like identity is part of the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, so you had asked earlier why I chose to set it during Occupy Wall Street, and the the honest answer is it it's because I started writing this book in 2014 and I was
Mm,
going to write a campus novel. I set it during the time when I was in college. So
sure.
these were not sort of these issues were not at the forefront of my mind when I started writing the book because I started writing it like in a completely different era than the one we find ourselves in now. So I've had this sort of weird experience of publishing this book that I wrote during like a just in a very different time and place, politically, but also just in terms of like, the media landscape, the
Mhm.
rise of social media in particular. And then I've had, all these experiences where I'm promoting the book and I'm being asked about NFTs, right? And I'm like,
Oh,
and,
but
and
yeah,
like AI art, and like these things were not in my, these things were not happening while I was writing the book.
same.
And certainly, even if they had been happening while I was, in the process of finishing up the book, publishing a book takes such a long time that, I wouldn't have had the chance to make changes even if I'd wanted to. But I've seen like people reviewing the book saying, RIP, Preston, you'd have loved NFTs. And my reaction to that is that, hell yes, Preston, you would love NFTs.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's been sort of a kind of a surreal experience to write a book that does speak to all these, issues of identity in particular and personal branding, and to sort of not have totally been intentional about that. Uh,
Mm.
and just finding that they kind of speak to like the current cultural climate that we find ourselves in.
Dude, that's so wild, right? Like we are now officially the age where just by living and creating whatever artworks that take a long time to create, we can be in a time warp. Like literally just by like writing a novel, right? Set at a certain time and place. It's like just what you're saying, the process of drafting and production and publication takes such a long time that you are sort of like jolted into this like, oh my God, I'm looking back and forward at once, which is I mean, that's kind of it's a cool experience. It actually kind of reminds me of did Uncut Gems.
No,
Um
I have not seen that.
I
Should I
feel
watch it?
like please watch it, if only for this like wild detail where I guess there was sort of some kind of snafu between production and distribution, whereby it's accidentally a period piece. It's accidentally set in like, sometime between 2007 and 2009, and it's released like over a decade later. And it's just sort of because it took a long time to make. It's not because, the directors, the brothers whose name I'm spacing on right now, were like, okay, well, what do we want to say about
The Safdie brothers?
the Safdies? Thank you. The Safdies weren't like, what do we want to say about this time and place? Like why is it 2009 in New York City? It's like, now we
Yeah.
just,
Yeah, I mean, like, I did not want, there was nothing I wanted to say in particular about that time period. I just happened to write it just as I was coming out of that time period. Uh,
yeah,
it's a kind of like a cool, happy accident, I guess.
yes.
But it is weird when like Gen Z readers come up to me at bookstore events and are like, "Oh, I didn't know about Occupy. This was some really interesting historical fiction." And I'm just like, "Wow, I'm old."
I don't worry. I definitely have a character in the book I'm working on, like a distinct Gen Z character who says something to the effect of like, "Oh wow, Arcade Fire. I mean, yeah, they're like my favorite band. I just love those deep cuts. I feel like I was born in the wrong generation. Like I love the dad rock. Just name a 2010s band. But yeah, I mean, it's so cool. I find it really cool because like, yes, understand that you weren't like, I will consciously say something about this time and place, but you have, and you've
I
done
mean, and that's one of the cool things about like making art is that
it.
sometimes you stumble into like this, deeper meaning or deeper resonance that other people pick up on that you totally didn't intend. And it's this like wonderful, happy little accident.
Ugh, I love that. Well, actually, that segues perfectly into my next question here. Um, because I wanted to talk about the fact that this book contains, I think, one of my favorite yeah, I don't know, like sort of like subgenres of feminist narrative, which is like in a hyper patriarchal space. These two women, often two queer women, often two lovers, are going to outsmart all the men, or they're going to carry on their affair, right? Literally right under dudes' noses, simply because the space is so ultra patriarchal that there would be no way to detect the lesbianism happening in plain sight. So, obviously like I'm just, ugh, I'm head over heels for the Louisa Karina romance. And as I was reading it, I know I brought up Portrait of a Lady on Fire earlier. I mean, it's hard, especially with the selection you read, it's hard not to kind of draw that comparison of you have, these one woman is posing for another woman, right? The woman who's posing is committed to a man. And yet, right, even though we're talking about whatever the 18th or 19th century versus 2011 on an art school campus, there's are still some like very intense patriarchal, heteropatriarchal strictures kind of holding these women in place. And I think they also really play profoundly into Karina's narrative. And that, which by the way, is another thing I identified with, like sort of having opportunities, but also being held in place by men.
Mm.
And so, like you really drew inspiration from a lot of incredible female artists, like living female artists and their artworks for Karina and Louisa. The Francesca Woodward, the photographer, I think, You'll have to remind me of the name of the queer artist who paints her lover or who paints
Jenna
her.
Gribben.
Say again.
Jenna Gribben.
Jenna, thank you, Oh God, Jenna Gribben's work is gorgeous. And yeah, I'm just kind of like really, really, really curious about how you went about sort of like inhabiting the world that Karina and Louisa inhabit. Um, kind of constructing their like narrative as a couple, right? Like as lovers, as girlfriends, and what inspiration you drew from other female artists, queer or not, and kind of how they built their world.
Yeah, so the book involved a lot of research into the art world. Because I am not myself a visual artist. I'm the daughter of one and I'm married to one, but I'm not, I'm not a painter. So while I was researching this book, I discovered these artists who really spoke to me. So, like Jenna Gribben, like you mentioned, Laura Owens is another one. But one of the really kind of wonderful and sort of semi-serendipitous things about writing this book is that the two artists who I think influenced me the most were both artists that I knew personally.
Oh,
Um,
so
so one of them is a woman named Kayla Zeke, who actually grew up with my husband.
oh,
They went to high school together and both studied art. And she is based in Lafayette, Louisiana. Um, and the first time I saw her art was in like maybe 2015 or 2016. I had been working on the book for a couple of years. And I had figured out what each of the characters' um, art looked like, except for Louisa. I could not figure out what Louisa's art looked like. And I went to this art festival in New Orleans called White Linen Night. Like a one night event where they close down the street called Julia Street, where all the art galleries are, and everyone wears white and walks around, drinking champagne and like wandering in and out of art galleries. It's great fun. Anyway, Kayla had a solo show, and I went to see it. Um, and I remember walking into the gallery and first just being struck by how incredible the work was. She's really focused on the female form, but also is really interested in flora and fauna from, South Louisiana, but also mythology. And so she had these like, kind of crazy like bird woman paintings. And I had this really intense reaction to her art. And I remember vividly thinking, this is what Louisa's art looks like. This is her.
oh,
Um, and that moment stands out to me because there are so few moments in writing a book where kind of all the narrative problems that you've been having are solved in one fell swoop. And that was one of those moments. Um, And then the other artist who ended up really influencing the book is an artist called Hannah Lutz Winkler. Not Kayla, not Hala, Hannah Hannah Lutz Winkler. She's another artist I know personally. I went to college with her. And for her senior thesis, she did a bowerbird installation. If you've read the book, you know that like the bowerbird nest kind of plays an important
yeah,
role.
yeah.
Um, Literally, but also kind of symbolically as, a running metaphor throughout the novel about our impulse to make art. And so she did this incredible bowerbird nest installation where she built a little nest and then she gathered all these like blue objects and then like perched in the nest herself with a bowerbird mask on. Um, and I just remember thinking it was so cool, but also that I really, really resonated with this idea of the bowerbird being this animal that makes art almost instinctively and can't really stop itself from doing it. And that does it as a kind of uh, a form of survival, right? They build these elaborate nests to attract a mate. Um, And sometimes their nest doesn't seduce a mate, but they do it anyway, kind of compulsively.
Yeah.
Um, and that sort of became a running thread throughout the novel.
Mm, I love that. And I'm thinking. Oh, the Bowerbird section is it's so lovely, and that's actually another kind of a side character, but the photographer who in your book who builds the bowers and photographs them, I relate to her a lot as well. She's a fantastic character, and she's someone who's kind of like Louisa, finding her footing in
Inez.
between
Mhm.
the ignored and vaunted. Like there's so many places to exist in the art world that we never get to learn about in art school. But yeah, kind of my follow-up question. I'm I'm thinking of like ekphrasis, right? Like I'm thinking of how you do a lot of ekphrastic work of like describing and responding to art in this book. And you also like had experience like kind of an ekphrastic, like a poetic experience of being like, oh my God, this art is incredible. All my narrative problems are solved, right? And so like how did you, I don't know, how like I guess I'm wondering like how do you see that sort of that like responding to art and like making a piece of art, like writing a book, right? That's also a response to visual artworks. Like how did that I guess I'm wondering what that was like, right? It's almost like a mise en abîme of artworks. You're like looking, you're seeing like endless. I felt endless in the most pleasurable way. You're seeing like reflections of your own creativity in others and others in yours, and it's just kind of cool. So, what was that like for you?
I mean, that's one of the things that I love most about consuming art is just being reminded of how we don't write books in a vacuum, we don't make paintings in a vacuum, we don't compose music in a vacuum. Any piece of art is sort of this accumulation of experiences and references and obsessions. Um, and I think the best art kind of reminds us of that cross-pollination and makes us think of like all these other different things and encourages us to draw connections between disparate areas of our lives. Um, I think I think for me it kind of it one of the things it makes me think of is sort of what it's been like to be in a long-term partnership with a creative person in a different medium. Like I'm not married to another writer. I'm married to a visual artist who's also an architect. Um, and one of the ways that I've grown the most as a writer is kind of having my partner read my work and having him sort of read it through a very, very different lens. So for example, he's very good with structure, obviously, because, he's an architect, he has to be. And sort of having him read my work and having him sort of see the book as like a house and help me see the book as a house and kind of help me approach it from a completely different angle. Um, and I mean I love hanging out with writers, but I think it can sometimes start to feel like a little bit insular, a little bit inside baseball. And one of the most um pleasurable things for me is sort of getting to hang out with a creative person who works in a totally different medium, right? Maybe like they do textiles, or like they're a gardener, or um, you know, they're a sculptor, and sort of getting to access a mind that thinks creatively in a really different way than I do, and kind of getting to borrow or steal little bits of insight and then apply it to my own work.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's I can relate to that too. Yeah, the meeting of creative minds, but like coming from different mediums. It's just it's productive in some really cool ways. Um, well, that actually this brings me to my final question. The kind of, we're talking about the compulsion to create, right?
Mhm.
Well, I think that the modest little audience who's going to check this out, right? They're probably here because they too, want to write their novels and publish their books. And, for a variety of reasons, right? But I think the primary one being, hey, like I love writing. I've got a story to tell, right? And we've been talking this whole time, Antonia, you and I have both been kind of beating around the bush about this. We've talked about how to get back from those sets of professional expectations or those comparisons or those hard things, get back to the creativity, but neither you nor I has really stated how we've gone about doing. And so, I think that a lot of folks would be really, really curious to hear, right? Like how, it's one thing for to be told the art world is not a zero-sum game. There are so many different ways to get your work into the world. There are so many different ways to connect with people. Art isn't just obscurity or celebrity, right? And there are also so many ways to go back and find that creative seed within oneself and not just sort of dwell on the hard stuff. But how and what and where and what, like I think people might have some questions to that effect. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how to find that, first of all, how to find that creative spark, and second of all, what are some different ways that a creative life could look?
Well, I think you and I are great examples. We are neither obscure nor famous, but we're both thriving,
Mhm.
both doing well.
Yeah.
Um, but to go back to your question, I think actually that a lot of the cliche advice that people give writers is actually really wise.
Mhm.
Um, like, make an enemy of envy. Don't compare yourself to other people. It's really hard. I still do it. Stay off the internet. Easier said than done, but I became such a happier and more productive person when I stopped using Twitter, for example.
Oh my God.
Um,
Oh, so sorry.
um,
Retweet.
I think, okay, the write what you know advice, I I would rephrase that slightly to write about what fascinates you. I think, like I said before, when you're writing a book, you're kind of in it for the long haul.
Mhm.
And the best way to keep yourself going is to write about something that's never going to bore you.
Yeah.
Um, I also think it's really important to have a life outside of writing, to have relationships with people who aren't writers, to have hobbies. Um, I really love to cook, for example, and I get a lot of creative fulfillment and energy out of that. Because honestly, cooking is like the exact opposite of writing a book. You can start and finish a dish in less than an hour, and then you can give it to someone and watch them enjoy it. Um, which, it's creative, but it also gives you the kind of instant gratification that you are never, ever, ever, ever going to get from writing books.
That is true. Oh man.
Uh, um, and like obviously my career means a lot to me. Being a writer is really central to who I am. Um, I, you know, I've always told my writing students to take themselves really seriously. I think it's important to take yourself seriously. For a really long time as a young woman, I had a really hard time taking myself seriously. And I feel like it's something we need to teach, I think, little girls in particular, that they are not inherently ridiculous. And that it's okay to like be like, I am a serious artist. I'm a serious writer. But also at the same time, remember to touch grass. Like, there's nothing more humbling to me than hanging out with my toddler. She doesn't know that I'm a writer. She doesn't know what I do for a living. She gives not a single shit about how many copies my book has sold. Um, uh,
I'm
and
so scared if she did.
yeah,
Mom, don't feed me unless you've sold at least 10,000 copies.
yeah, she
Not your
doesn't care.
advance, Mom? Like, I don't want these chicken nuggets. Oh man.
And I think that's important too. I think the literary world can get kind of, I don't know, it can consume you. That whole scene can become a mind fuck really quick.
Yes.
Um, yeah. I don't know if that advice was
It's
actually going to be
excellent.
helpful to anyone, but that's what has worked for me.
No, I think I find it to be excellent advice. I will, yeah, I mean, I'll add the little bit I have to add, right, is like, you know, is like write what fascinates you is that's a fantastic kind of guideline to follow. I'd also say, like, going back to earlier in our conversation, right to understand, right? Like if something confuses you, write about it. And I think that actually does kind of fly in the face of write what you know, right? We're expected to write what we're experts on. And I think this is how we kind of run afoul of this really rough
Mhm.
identity crisis that I think millennial fiction is having, where it's like, okay, I'm marginalized and I know what it is to be marginalized and I must write about only that, and it becomes a little bit intense because, well, I won't go off into the politics of that, but it can become intense. And so I think writing as this like really pleasurable sort of like getting to know oneself, getting to sort of explore a problem, is a way better model, I think. I would agree. Oh God, well, don't let me tell you about it here. Just read my next book. I was consumed by envy. I was consumed not just jealousy, but by like, because I had plenty of that too, but I was also like, oh, like I would even begrudge immensely talented people, right? My age, older, younger, whatever. I would compare, and I'd be like, oh, they have that, I should have that. It's like there's this sense of scarcity. And I
Mhm.
think this is actually what you've written, accidentally, but really, really beautifully. You've written a book that is so important, because of its grounding in time and place, right? This book, the Occupy movement, really showed us that like scarcity is both a like wealth scarcity is a thing that's happening and a fiction, right? Like there's a 99% and a 1%, and that doesn't have to be the case. This is just sort of a fabrication of like capital proceeding towards its like bizarre and horrible ends. But you know, I think I started to really internalize. It worked the same way for me with substance abuse issues, actually. It's not that I was like, no, don't do the drugs, bad. It was like, I was like, I'm so bored. I don't care. I don't care about doing the drugs. And in the same reason, the envy and the comparison and this person's more successful. Oh, I'm a loser. It just, that whole paradigm, I lost interest in it, because it had hurt me so much, because it was throttling my creativity, and because it started to make less and less sense, Antonia. Because just what you're saying, right? Here we are, in in the Midwest, right? We're not in New York, right? We're not in LA. Um, and we're having great writing lives and we're making connections in the ways we want to. And I think that's what it's hard for a lot of folks who are getting started in their writing careers to understand, just like we've been saying, you don't have to move to New York. If it wouldn't bring you joy, does it spark joy? Then don't move.
Yeah, you don't have to move to New York. You don't have to get an MFA.
You don't have to get an
You,
MFA.
you don't have to do any of the things that people tell you that like you literally all you have to do to be a writer, literally all you have to do is write.
It's
Like that's
right.
the one requirement.
It's one requirement, right? And then, like, I think, the way Sirens and Muses has its characters, because there's a whole, it's just so wild. There is gatekeeping, right? Yes, of course there's gatekeeping. Of course there's hurdles you have to jump. If you are someone who has that creative spark and is like, you know what, I'm gonna be crazy here. Let me go share this with the world through these channels. Yes, there are things you have to navigate, right? In the same way, though, that there are things that you and I have to navigate if we decide to go to the park one day and it's a busy day. We go to the, shopping mall. I don't know, right? But it is um it's a kind of like a negotiation of your desires with others' desires. It's being in the world. It's sort of interfacing with other people. And so it feels like insurmountable, but that's really what it boils down to is other people, right? And hermiting versus, not, and I think, right, like I had a friend ask me recently. They were like, would you keep writing? You have a stipend like for the rest of your life. You're taken care of. You don't have to worry about money or anything. But you're never good. No one's ever going to read your writing. Would you keep writing? Antonia, if they had asked me that even a year ago, I'd be like, are you crazy? No. Now I was like, yeah, fuck yeah. Fuck yeah, I
Yeah.
would.
I might take that deal.
Like,
I might like negotiate like, okay, can I have two people read my writing? Like two people.
well, hear me out, hear me out. I promise I'm not like choosing a monk. What I was actually talking about this with my wife earlier. I was like, I would choose to do that if it were like my path on this earth, right? If my path were like, I want to do this hermetic creativity because it is a compulsion, just like you say that it is like, and like I think you and I share it. I think tons of people share it. We're gonna make art. Like
Yeah,
I'm gonna fucking write. Like if you want to publish this, amazing. If you don't, I will still continue to
yeah,
write.
yep,
Um, and if it were my path and I was like, I want this and it's part of my existence to not really show it to others, then I would pursue that path. It is not my path. I do want to show it to others, right? But I think increasingly as I'm getting older, it's more about like, I'm excited about these ideas being in the world and less about praise my ideas,
yeah,
give me money. Am I famous? Am I the best? Am I the winner? And like the way you have the anointed character in your book, the way Karina ends up reacting to it, I think there's such wisdom in the way you wrote that. Like it doesn't solve everything, it's
no,
external validation doesn't just like,
no,
oh, you have no mental health issues now.
yeah, yeah. I think there's a little piece of advice that Inez gives Luisa, and that's a piece of advice that I give myself frequently, which is that you cannot be doing this for external validation. There has to be something else motivating you.
Yes.
Because the validation is never going to be enough. It's never going to feel like enough, no matter how much you get. You're always going to want more. It's going to become this black hole inside you that will never be filled. So there has to be something else that's driving you. Then that has to come from inside you.
Yes. From the same place, the compulsion to create.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the decision to share it with the world, right? It's so hard to decouple that from the external validation piece. I am still working on it, but the
Same.
decision to share it from the world, I would feel like has to come from the same place. Like I'm confident, I'm excited about this great idea, and I want to share it with people. And your message that like we need to instill that sense of confidence, even especially in young women and girls, I think is really important because man, is it hard to take yourself seriously when you're, a 12-year-old kid in pigtails and you're like, but I really want to write this story with a Joycean epiphany or what I mean like it's no one is taking you seriously. And so yeah, it's important stuff. Um before I stop the recording, I want to ask you, my friend, can you tease the viewing listening audience with your next project? What are you comfortable sharing? You don't have to share too much, just whatever you're comfortable sharing. I'm sure folks will be excited to hear.
Sure. Yeah. I should warn you ahead of time that I'm really bad at elevator pitches. This is a
It's
skill that
not, no,
I need
this
to work
is
on.
It's a
Okay.
broken
So
escalator, Antonia. We're not in an elevator. We have all the time in the world.
we're in a Zoom box. My Zoom
Yeah,
box.
exactly.
Um,
Stopped.
so it is also a love story. It is two intertwined love stories um happening at two different points in the main character's life. The first one, while she is coming of age in Costa Rica, which is also where I grew up, on a butterfly farm that her parents run, and then the second one, um, while she is in her mid-20s teaching Spanish at a private school where she falls in love with with one of her colleagues who teaches French. So I would say it's primarily a love story, a braided love story, but it's also about language and untranslatability and bilingualism, biculturalism, bisexuality, neocolonialism,
Mm.
bunch of different
The themes.
floating around. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that sound fluttering around like butterflies. That sounds
Like little
phenomenal.
butterflies, yes.
I love it. I cannot wait to read it. Thank you so much for being on the Podstack.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun.
So fun. I'm going to pause, or well, stop the recording rather, but I very much appreciate it. And everyone watching this, listening to this, wow, read this book. Read it. It's so good. And I'll see you next week.